Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to York Festival of Ideas 2026. My name is Laura Yeoman. I am Access and Digital Engagement Archivist at the Borthwick Institute for Archives at the University of York, and I also have specialist responsibility for the Borthwick's medieval records as well. And I'm delighted to be your chair for the session this afternoon. Okay, so without further ado, I am delighted to introduce our speaker, Katherine Harvey. So Katherine is a historian and an honorary research fellow at Birkbeck University of London, and she also teaches at the Open University. In her most recent book, which Katherine is here to discuss today, she sheds light on the practical and surprising, relatable ways medieval individuals cared for body and mind. She discusses historical sources that echo today's wellness concerns and offers a fresh, thoughtful view of a misunderstood era. We're delighted that Katherine is joining us today to talk about her book, The Medieval Guide to Healthy Living. So Katherine, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. It's lovely to see so many people here this afternoon. And yeah, as Laura just said, this afternoon I'm going to be talking about medieval ideas about healthy living, which I think it's fair to say most people think is a bit of a contradiction, because if we think about the Middle Ages, we tend to think of them about being sort of dirty, smelling, not very keen on washing, and living quite sort of short, nasty lives, where the idea of sort of trying to live a long, healthy one would be quite ridiculous. So the idea that they might have been worrying about things like healthy diets or exercise or getting enough sleep seems unlikely. But I'm hoping this afternoon, to convince you otherwise. Because I think those stereotypes are all quite unfair to the Middle Ages, because, life was hard. It was much harder than ours in a lot of ways. And life expectancy was lower, although it's quite heavily skewed by a very high infant mortality. But what's very clear to me, as it became clear to me as I was writing my book, is just how interested our medieval ancestors were in healthy living, just as we were. And just as we think that the key to living a long, healthy life is to think about a good, healthy lifestyle, they were doing exactly the same. And that belief was very much anchored in their belief in the four humours, which were blood and phlegm and black bile and yellow bile. And they're four fluids that they think, if you keep those in balance in your body, you'll stay healthy. If they get out of balance, you'll get ill. So medieval ideas about healthy living are all focused on what can you do to keep those four fluids in balance. And the key to those, it's another little list of the 6 non-naturals. And they are air and environment, food and drink, exercise, sleep and rest, excretion, and what they call the passions of the soul, what we'd call emotions. And they thought that if you kept those things going along the right lines, that would help you to keep your humours in balance, and it would help you to stay healthy. And by the later Middle Ages, the period my book focuses on between about 1200 and 1500, those ideas were really quite widely discussed and really quite established in medieval society. Relatively ordinary people like us would know about them, not just elite medical practitioners. And they trickle down, so that they all start off in the sort of the universities and the really elite practitioners, but ordinary people will hear about them from more local practitioners, even in very rural societies. We know about sort of what we would now call quacks, who are nevertheless talking about the humours and talking along these same lines. And by the end of the Middle Ages, people are reading books called regimens, which are basically how-to books about how to stay healthy. And so these are really sort of the basis of my book, these books that tell us all about what medieval people thought you had to do to stay healthy. And so, this afternoon, I'm going to talk about what people thought about these 6 non-natural factors and how they thought that controlling those could help you to stay healthy. And so I'm going to work through them in turn, starting with the idea that your environment was key to your health. Because air really was at the heart of medieval ideas about health. They thought that pure, clean air was essential for life, but because air was so light, it very easily got corrupted, turned nasty, and then if you breathed in, it goes right to the centre of your body, and it will make you ill. And so according to the 13th century physician Aldo Brandino of Siena, he said, there are few things which harm a man more than bad air, because poisonous air goes straight to the heart and it can kill. And so that meant that the air where you lived was one of the big factors determining how healthy you were. So they thought, for example, if you were lucky enough to live up in the mountains where the air was particularly clear and clean and pure, that would sort of really help to make you strong and healthy. Whereas if you lived somewhere very marshy, they were worried about what the air would do to you. And actually, quite surprisingly to us, because we tend to think of sort of seaside air as being healthy, they were worried about it being quite damp and sort of therefore imbalancing your humours. So you can't go on a healthy sort of recovering trip at the seaside in the Middle Ages. That whole convalescent idea came much later. They also thought that it sort of varied quite widely by region. So although it hasn't felt like it the past week, our sort of relatively mild, temperate climate was much healthier than the sort of the very hot air of the Middle East. They thought that was much better for your health. And the air of your native place was almost always better for you. So if people move a long way from home, there's a 13th century Bishop of Durham who he resigns because he's ill, and he needs to go home to his native Surrey because the air and the food of his native place should make him better. He was also rumoured to have had a wife. That might have had something to do with it. But it was officially about the health of his native place. They were also very interested in how weather affects your health. And so, obviously, in the sense that you need to protect yourself from the extremes of weather. So, if it's raining, you wear a raincoat, much as we'd still do. But also, actually, they were very interested in, and again, this feels quite topical at the moment, sort of unstable, changeable weather as being a cause of disease. And the St Albans chronicler, Matthew Paris, was particularly interested in this. There's a lot in his chronicle about how bad weather. So if you get a very hot summer followed by a very wet autumn, say, then he talks about how then there were lots of chronic diseases and gasping fevers and things in the autumn into the winter. So they were quite worried about that side of things. But obviously your air and your environment, if you got it right, could also help you to stay healthy. And certainly but towards the end of the Middle Ages, the rich are putting an awful lot of effort into creating these healthy homes that are sort of ticking all their boxes in terms of health. And so thinking about things like, where is it in terms of the air? Have you got a clean water supply? Are you protected from things like bad smells and extremes of temperature? And they also get really interested in gardens. Gardens as a sort of really healthy thing to have. And obviously partly that's about places to relax, places to exercise. But it's also about things like green grass. Looking at green grass was thought to strengthen the eyesight. So it was sort of refreshing it would help to protect your eyesight in the long term. That sweet-smelling flowers sort of stimulate the senses and help you to keep you healthy. It didn't work for everybody. Gerard, Archbishop of York in the early 12th century, he was ill and went out into his garden to enjoy, the chronicler said, a more healthful breeze freshened by the sweet scent of flowers, and promptly died. Slightly spoiled the theory, but broadly speaking, for most of us, gardens were a really healthy addition to a home. Now, obviously, most people weren't living like these rich sorts in this lovely garden. In most medieval cities, including here in York, most people would have been living in single-room dwellings above shops or sort of very small single-storey terraced houses. And out in the countryside, too, peasant houses are pretty basic, although much more stable than we think. They're supposed to last decades. The foundations are pretty good, actually. And the animals, if they live in the house, do live in a partitioned-off bit. This idea they were all sort of sharing the same beds is nonsense. But all the evidence suggests that rich and poor alike were very interested in, keeping their houses clean, regular sweeping and dusting, washing their bedclothes and their clothes, dealing with vermin. So I say this idea that sort of medieval homes were just filthy is really not very fair. And there's lots of evidence that people like their surroundings to be clean. And that's partly because, as we've said, that they think that human bodies are very badly affected by bad air. But also by looking at things, because they've got this idea that when you look at something, you literally absorb the properties of it. If you look at a dung heap, for example, you will absorb some of the properties of that dung heap with all its stinkiness and bad air that's going to make you ill. So actually, keeping things clean is really important to them. And that means that throughout Europe, from about the 12th century, and really intensifying once we get into the Black Death period, there's an awful lot of public health legislation in medieval Europe, which is probably not something we associate with the Middle Ages. We tend to think we invented public health. But authorities are pouring increasing amounts of money into things like employing street cleaners and dustmen, encouraging residents. In some cities, the residents are actually obliged to go out and clean the street outside their house every week, or they'll get fined. They employ inspectors to make sure that this is done. There are strict rules about where you can dump rubbish. They limit where the people who are practicing the smelliest crafts are restricted to certain areas of the city, things like tanners, so that those smells are kept in one place and don't make the whole city ill. They're also very interested or concerned by butchery as a source of illness, because it's seen as being particularly stinky. And so there are a lot of cases. There's a great case from London in about 1450 where a chap called Thomas Cornwallis took 6 butchers to court because they dumped dung and intestines and all sorts of other byproducts of their trade in his back garden. And it's very clear from his complaint, he sees this as putting his household, him and his household, in physical danger. This isn't just about, it's not nice to be there, it's very much, this is going to make us ill. And I could go on and on about public health for the next hour, I'm not going to. But there are lots of rules about food markets, what they can sell and how they must dispose of the food afterwards. People could be and were prosecuted for selling bad food that made people ill. Civic authorities and also big institutions like monasteries built increasingly sophisticated water systems to make sure that the city's got a clean supply of water and that the waste is properly disposed of and they don't mix, to try and keep people healthy. And they also get increasingly keen on building public toilets. There was a set over the river here in York by about 1300 with a widow employed to keep them clean. And where those obviously drained into the river, but the sorts of toilets that have to be go into the pits and then have to be emptied, almost always that was done at night, so there were few people around, so that they weren't made ill by the bad smells. So it really does, that idea of bad smells really does affect how they run things. So I think, yeah, it's fair to say that medieval people shared our concerns with their surroundings, and they were also just as interested in us as what they ate, the idea that their diet made them healthy. In fact, because of the way they thought that things were processed, so that they thought that the liver was continually making new blood from what they ate every day, rather than, as we now know, keep circulating around the body. In a very literal sense, they thought that you were what they ate. So, it really mattered in terms of keeping you healthy. Although their ideas were quite different to ours, because whereas we would now think in terms of eating a diet that was high in protein or low in fat or trying to avoid carbs or whatever, they're going back to this humoral thing. And so they're thinking in terms of hot and cold and wet and dry and what effect that's going to have on the balance of your humours. Which leads them to, I think it's fair to say, some rather interesting conclusions. So, for example, things that we tend to think healthy, we would say if you eat lots of fresh fruit, that's good for you. They were worried that it was too cold and moist and it would make you ill. And at fish, we tend to think of fish as being the healthy option, but definitely, according to them, it's really dangerous, it's really cold, it's really wet, it produces a lot of phlegm. And they're worried about, to the point, Thomas Becket performs miracles where he heals people who have been made ill by eating too much fish. Yeah. Now, fortunately, because obviously a lot of people liked fish and a lot of monks had to eat a lot of fish, fortunately there were ways that you could make it healthier, including by cooking. So ideally, fish you would fry or you would roast rather than boiling it, because that helps to make it in hot, cold, wet, dry terms a bit healthier. And they were also really keen on sauces and seasonings. And obviously one of the reasons they like them is for the same reasons as we still do. It makes things taste better. But it was also about, again, improving the qualities of food. So if you add a warming sauce to your cold fish, it makes it a bit healthier by mitigating that. They were also actually, although they were keen on salt, for different reasons to us, they were quite keen on the idea that you shouldn't eat too much salt, because they thought they were worried about it drying out the body rather than blood pressure. But that was something else they were quite keen on, moderation. And something else they definitely thought you could have too much of was alcohol. Which, yeah, he's definitely having too much of. And, I think medieval people did drink a lot of alcohol by our standards. A quite horrifying percentage of the average peasant's calories on a daily basis were coming from ale, and rich people were drinking a lot of wine. And they thought it was a really healthy drink. Actually, wine is basically the perfect drink, according to the Middle Ages doctors. It's warm, it's moist, but not too much of either, to the point where some doctors suggest you should give babies wine. Don't give your babies wine. Having said that, I mean, again, I think one of the popular stereotypes is that medieval people are drinking so much ale because the water's filthy that they're all drunk all the time. And some of them obviously were drunk, but they weren't all drunk all of the time, partly because they did drink water, and they were quite keen on doing sensible things like boiling it to make it safe, partly because the ale was very weak by our standards, and they water down their wine a lot. And they do that quite explicitly for health reasons, because they know that too much strong drink, they're worried about it making you drunk, they're also worried about it sort of overheating your body and making you ill. So alcohol is definitely seen as part of a healthy diet in a way that maybe now it isn't. But still the message is very much, in moderation, be sensible. And I mean, moderation, I think, is very much the watchword when it comes to medieval diets and medieval food. And that's not just for medical reasons. It's sort of reinforced by the fact that conductory books are saying, it's unseemly to be greedy. And the church is going, it's gluttony, it's a sin to eat too much. But there is also definitely a health dimension. And although I think medieval people probably weren't as hung up on their weight as often we are, they were very clear that to be either very fat or very thin was bad for you, that it would have an effect on your health. And so definitely medieval medical texts do talk about the dangers of obesity. And they tend to talk mainly in terms of what we would now call being morbidly obese. One of my favourite definitions of what's too fat, according to a medieval doctor, is when you're too fat to wipe your own bottom. That seems a pretty low bar. Yeah. But, I mean, I think so sometimes, again, there's this stereotype that, in the Middle Ages, the fatter you were, the better, because it showed how rich you were. And actually, there's a lot of grousing and criticism in medieval chronicles about kings and bishops who are too fat because they can't perform their duties properly. So, for example, there's an Archbishop of York in the 12th century who gets criticised because he's very fat. He's so fat he can barely walk. And that actually means he can't do his job properly. He's not strong enough to go into exile. And so, yeah, they're worried about it from that point of view too. And today, I mean, we'd probably think somebody like this Archbishop ought to do some exercise because we're very much into the relationship between exercise and health and weight. And they didn't think about exercise and weight loss quite in the same way as we do, but they definitely did see it as part of a healthy lifestyle. It does all sorts of good things for you. It removes bodily superfluities because it makes you sweat, so you'll sweat them out. They think it improves your digestion, it improves your sleep, it tones your body. So a lot of the things that we still think are benefits of exercise. And a lot of the things they did for exercise are the same activities that we still do. So walking is often talked about in the Middle Ages as the ideal form of exercise because most people can do it, so it's quite widely suitable, and it moves the whole body, which they think is particularly good. But I mean, they also do things like horse riding and playing board games like these two on the slide. They even go swimming, ice skating in the winter. People who needed to exercise indoors, either because of the bad weather or because it was beneath their dignity to exercise in public, which seems to be something the clergy were particularly concerned about, that they couldn't really be seen exercising by the congregations. They were encouraged to do exercise indoors, and things like lifting weights. So you need a big stick or some big stones and lift them indoors, which I don't think is something that I'd imagine people in the Middle Ages doing, but definitely it's there in the records. They did have some slightly odd ideas about what counted as exercise, though, because they thought it had to be something you were doing voluntarily. So if you're working in the fields all day, for example, I'd call that hard physical labour. They said that didn't count as exercise. But on the other hand, they thought the key things you were trying to do, you were aiming for deeper breathing and you were aiming to move fluids around your body. And so actually some quite surprising things count as exercise. So singing, because it makes you breathe deeper, or having a massage because it helps to move things around the body, or if you're rocking a baby in a cradle, then the baby's effectively exercising. So yeah. But obviously, you need your exercise, but you also need your rest. And they are very keen on this idea that it's important to rest, and it's important in particular to sleep, and that getting enough sleep is crucial to being healthy. And again, their ideas are quite similar to ours. They tend to recommend 6 to 8 hours for adults. They're not very keen on the idea of napping in the day. They think that's bad for you. And sadly for night owls, the idea that it was already, the idea that you should get up early in the morning was already very well established by this point. And it's very clear that, people were worrying about whether they were getting enough sleep. And that if they didn't, would it make them ill? They thought it would make them ill. And that comes across in lots of sources, but I think probably my favourite example is the letters of a woman called Margherita Dantini, who in the late 14th century is writing to her husband Francesco, who's a merchant who travels a lot, so there's a lot of letters as he's away from home. And she's always fussing to him about he needs to stop staying up late. He's staying up staying up late working. It's not good for him. He's going to make himself ill. He needs to stop. And because they're worried about getting enough sleep, there's a lot of stuff in medieval medical texts about what we now call sleep hygiene. And so, it's important not to eat just before you go to bed. You should let the food settle for a few hours first so that it could be properly digested overnight. They're quite keen on making sure that the room is properly dark. They're quite keen on making sure that it's the right temperature. And that, in a world without central heating, often the problem is that it's too cold. So it's about, having nice bed curtains or a nightcap to keep you warm. Whatever you need to keep you warm at night is really important. And we also have got stuff about sort of people's bedtime routines. So the idea that it was a good idea before you went to bed to do something that would calm you down. So to listen to a bit of music or to say some prayers. It's a 14th century Castilian nobleman who's plagued by insomnia who gets one of his servants to read to him when he can't sleep to help relax him. So yeah, a lot of relatable stuff there, I think. Now, a lot of what I've talked about so far, sort of all this healthy eating and exercise and getting enough sleep, makes a lot of sense to us. But there are quite a lot of other pre-modern health practices that have, quite fortunately, fallen by the wayside, particularly those that relate to excretion as a non-natural. Medieval people were, I think this is probably one of the few stereotypes that is true, they were very keen on bloodletting. And it was used both to prevent diseases and to treat them, because it's a really efficient way to get rid of an overabundance of bad humours. To be fair, doctors were very clear that this wasn't an alternative to a healthy lifestyle. You weren't supposed to spend all your time eating meat, drinking wine, sitting on your bottom, and then having this done every 6 weeks. And they were, I think, far more careful about it than we tend to think. So, they are very keen on the idea that it ought to be done by a skilled practitioner with the proper tools who will keep them clean, that you shouldn't be sort of bleeding somebody who's weak. So, small children, pregnant women, the very old, you only bleed them if it's sort of a real crisis where if you don't bleed them, they're going to die, so you may as well give it a go. And probably most people aren't bled on a preventative basis more than maybe once or twice a year. There are exceptions. Monks, for example, could be bled up to every 6 weeks. They were particularly keen on it. And that was partly because they were prone to health problems caused by celibacy, sex being seen as another form of excretion. And so, celibate men are prone to this problem where excess semen builds up inside their bodies, and it causes all sorts of problems of headaches and heart problems, and it can even kill you. Allegedly, there are quite a lot of medieval stories about particularly saintly clerics who are supposed to have been, sort of warned by their doctors, if you don't give up this celibacy lark, you're going to die. And obviously they're so saintly that they won't, so then they do die. But for the less saintly, phlebotomy can be a helpful way to balance that out. And there's a lot about excretion in the book that, again, I haven't got time to talk about all of them this afternoon, but urination, vomiting, defecation, they're all in there. It's a lovely book. But the other thing I do want to talk about today is personal hygiene, because, as we've already said, there are a lot of the stereotypes about the Middle Ages that very much suggest that not only I think that people were dirty, but that they didn't really care that they were dirty. And I think that's so unfair. And they knew from a medical perspective that washing was important because it removes dirt, but it also removes, again, all these sort of excretions that they're worried about. So things like sweat and mucus and earwax that are all thought to be made up of bad humours. So you don't want those on your body. They're going to make them ill. You want to get rid of them. And so people are very keen on it. It seems to have been quite normal for people to wash at least their hands and face when they got up in the morning, certainly to wash their hands before and after eating. I've even come across a 13th century conduct book for schoolboys which warns them not to do things that would make their hands dirty, like picking their ears or playing with animals. So, you know, they really are quite keen on the idea of keeping particular hands and face clean. And they're also much more enthusiastic about bathing than we think they are. You know, it's particularly nice for the rich, people like Edward III, who had this, you know, sort of really luxury tiled bathroom at Westminster with hot and cold running water, perfume, soaps, bath oils. You know, I think probably we'd quite enjoy Edward III's bathroom. Most people had to use one of these sort of wooden tubs, which had to be lined with a cloth so you didn't get splinters, and filled with water heated on the fire. But nevertheless, again, quite relatively ordinary people would have one of those in their house, and they were washing. People also went to public baths. That's actually a thermal spa, because I couldn't find in Italy, because I couldn't find a picture of a proper public bath. But there were quite a lot of public baths around. There were 30 odd in Paris by 1300. And again, even quite small towns of Scotland by the 15th century. And people are also very keen, particularly when it's hot, on bathing in rivers and lakes and the like. And unfortunately, we know about that mainly because then inevitably some of them get into trouble and they drown and they end up in the coroner's records, which is very sad for them, but very nice for me as a historian of hygiene to be able to find out all these people bathing in rivers when it gets hot. And people also, they wash their hair, often using ash and herbs. They clean their teeth. They were very keen on the idea of, it was often sort of rubbing with cloths, toothpicks, and they have all sorts of recipes for powders and things, a lot of them with ingredients that we still use for cleaning our teeth. There's a lot of mint in medieval tooth recipes. They're also talking more broadly about hygiene, very keen on doing their laundry. And again, that's not just because of bad smells, although they didn't like the smell of sweat any more than we do. There's a great 14th century case where an abbess in Italy tells her nuns they've got to wash more frequently and keep changing their shirts because she's sick of the smell of sweat in the choir. But they were also very worried about parasites, because up until the 17th century, when they worked out that they hatched from eggs, people thought that parasites were sort of spontaneously generated in dirt on the skin. So if you're not washing, you're going to end up with body lice, is basically what they think. And they don't want those any more than we do. And that's quite clear. So definitely, one of the best ways to keep yourself healthy is to keep you clean. So yeah, I hope that sort of demolishes the myth that medieval people were also all filthy. And that hygiene's a modern invention, which it definitely isn't. Oh yeah, there's some big parasites, but you definitely don't want those. Yeah. So yes, moving swiftly on from parasites to think about mental health as the last of the 6 non-naturals. And I mean, again, I think that we tend to think of mental health as being something we've only got really interested in the past few decades. But actually, they were very interested in the sort of the mind-body connection. So there's a lot of talk in these regimens about the importance of sort of keeping your emotions in check for the sake of your health. And I mean, violent emotions, things like fear and anger, are seen as particularly serious because they can just sort of kill you suddenly. But they worry about a lot of the things that we worry about. So they worry about, for example, long-term stress making you ill. Obviously, they think that high-status men are most prone to stress. And that's, you know, it's most likely to make them ill. But there are some fantastic cases. There's a monk at Rivo in the 13th century called Matthew, he's one of the office holders, and he writes to his friend at Ireland, complaining that this job, it's so hard, it's stressing him out so much, it's making him ill, he's got stomach pains, he's sure it's going to kill him. We don't know whether it did actually, but we do know there are quite a few medieval monks who are supposed to have had basically what we now call a breakdown because of overwork. There's a chap at St Albans, Alexander de Langley, who he sort of starts to have fits of raving and to give himself great airs, so they take the job away from him, but then he just starts studying too much. And the poor chap ends up locked up and being flogged to try and sort of, yeah, that was one of the ways, one of the less enlightened aspects of medieval medicine, flogging the mad. Yeah. And I mean, there are also lots of cases of what we'd call anxiety and depression. I've mentioned the Dattinis, Francesco, who couldn't get to sleep. And reading his letters, I think it's very clear that he was plagued by, both anxiety and depression. He frets about everything from the Black Death to his business going wrong. He's a tremendously successful merchant, and he's always terribly worried that one of his ships is going to get lost. And he's always writing to poor Margarita, telling her about how worried he is and how fed up he is, and she's always trying to calm him down. But, I mean, fortunately for men like him, the medical profession was increasingly interested in mental health and what you could do to sort of to keep yourself mentally well and how to treat yourself if you were like Tantini and you were struggling. And again, I mean, it's partly seen in humoral terms. So if you're a melancholic, for example, you've got an excess of black bile, and they'll give you drugs that are going to help you to sort that out. But they were absolutely convinced that what's really key is lifestyle. And basically sort of both the sick and the healthy need to do things that cheer them up. And a lot of the things that they are recommending are things that we would still recommend. So things like spending time with your family or going for a walk. They're very keen on getting out in nature in the Middle Ages, actually. You know, not quite in the forest bathing sense that we do it now. But yeah, the idea that it's good for you to exercise outside and sort of it gives you fresh air, it helps you to sort of distract you, to think on the glories of God's creation. So they're very keen on that. Reading, like this chap here, although it's important to be cheerful books. There's a medieval friar who gets told to stop reading horrible books about martyrdoms because they're going to make him ill, because they're too depressing. The other thing they're very interested in is the benefits of religion. And not just because going to church is, sort of pleasing to God and then he won't make you ill, but also because they think, they sort of see it as something that will improve your mood. So in the same way that spending time with your family might make you happier, going to church might make you happier, and therefore that's good for your health. So yeah, that's a whistle-stop tour through the non-naturals. What I want to talk about now is just a few examples of sort of how they applied these to particular groups of people. And so starting off with women. Obviously, as is still true today, very much the medical norm was men. But they did understand that male and female bodies were different and that they worked in different ways. And they do sometimes talk about that in their medical texts. And one of the obvious forms of difference was menstruation, which they're very interested in as a sort of a sign of whether or not a woman's healthy. Because they think that whereas men are naturally hot and dry, whereas women, we're cold and wet. And that means sort of we struggle to dry up our superfluities. So bleeding them out is the best way to get rid of them. And they think they have got these theories, some medical texts, I think probably written by men who'd never met a woman, that if a woman didn't menstruate, she'd swell up and eventually she'd die. But nevertheless, regular periods were very definitely seen as a sign of a woman's health, both of her fertility, that they were quite clear that if you didn't have periods, you probably couldn't get pregnant, but also as a sort of a general state of health, to the extent where there are cases from the late medieval Mediterranean where there was quite a lot of slavery going on, where people will actually buy a slave, and then if they find a woman isn't having periods, they try and sue the person who they bought her from, because they go, well, she's clearly not healthy then. I want my money back. So, it really is seen as absolutely fundamental to a woman's health. The other thing they talk about quite a lot is pregnancy. And there are actually regimens specifically for pregnant women. And they're very keen on the idea, in a way that feels quite uncomfortable to me, on the idea that a pregnant woman has a responsibility to look after herself. That's not the bit that I've got a problem with. It's the bit where people like the 15th century physician Michele Savonarola, who wrote one of these big regimens for pregnant women, he says, it's a great sin to miscarry by your own negligence, and if this occurs, you may certainly expect punishment and retribution. They're quite sort of worried about the idea. I think you can probably see on this picture that the fetus is thought to be sort of tied to the womb by these very fragile ligaments. And so they've got this idea that a bit like if you've got a pear on a tree or something, and you shake it too hard, the pear will fall off. They've got the same idea that this is what will happen with a baby. So that if a woman jumps around too much or sneezes too much or something, the baby will fall out. That's the slightly nuttier bit of it. But he does talk a lot of sense, to be fair. There's a lot of stuff in this regimen about sort of healthy eating, although that did include drinking wine again. About getting plenty of rest, taking gentle illness, taking gentle exercise, keeping a handle on your stress levels. So that's all quite sensible. And he's also very keen on the idea that once you've had a baby, you need a period of lying in, you need time to rest, you need sort of good foods to sort of strengthen you up. So it's, not all problematic. And medieval physicians were also very interested in the relationship between work and health, to the extent that doctors were supposed to ask about a patient's occupation before treating him. Because if you're a fisherman, you're working in a cold, wet environment, that will make your body colder and wetter. That will make you ill. Now that makes sense to us. Some of the other jobs they're worried about are maybe a bit more surprising. There was a lot of concern, for example, about scribes, possibly because the scribes are doing a lot of this writing, actually. They're sort of, but they're very worried about the fact it's, it's a very sedentary job and it's mentally very stressful. And so people like Edma are prone to eye strain and back pain and also bladder problems because they're apparently too busy to even go to the loo. And so that will make them ill. And yeah, as we've already touched on, the idea that priests, because of all the celibacy and all the fish, were prone to illness, but the regimens could help them. And so again, by the sort of the 14th, 15th centuries, there are regimens written specifically for clergy, and the wealthier ones are having personalised ones written for them to help them deal with these problems. The other time all of this really comes into the fore is when there are outbreaks of Black Death. And I think we tend to think of them as being totally powerless in the face of this, and obviously on one level they were, and the mortality rates were horrendous. But there seems to have been a strong sense that people felt that if you followed a good regimen, that you could you could improve your chances of not getting plague, and that if you did get plague, it would help you to survive it. And they've also got a lot of sensible ideas about the fact that it is caused by contaminated air, and that people breathing in and out, are spreading this by spreading their infected air. And so they do a lot of sensible things, like making people stay at home if they've got the plague. People, if in the Low Countries in the 15th century, if you live with somebody who's got the plague, you're allowed to go out if you really must, but you're supposed to carry a white stick so that people will know you come from a plague house and they can keep out of your way. They're also quite keen on taking something called theriac, which was a sort of opium-based cure-all. But people buy great jars of this, including the Pastons. In the Paston letters, they talk about this during a plague outbreak, buying big jars of theriac for the whole family, and then they sort of all take some every day to try and ward off the plague. Now, obviously, again, a lot of this wouldn't have worked. The thing that definitely wouldn't work was the Spanish chap who believes the secret to warding off the Black Death is to bleed a couple of pints from you in a week. He claims he's prevented lots of people getting the plague by doing that. But yeah, a lot of the stuff is more sensible. So it's about healthy living, which I suppose in the sense that the healthier you are, the better your chances of fighting off infection. It probably did help some people. And just one more group of people I want to mention briefly is the elderly, because I think I started off by saying, I think our idea of the Middle Ages is, well, there were no old people because they all died young, probably of plague. And obviously the infant mortality, as I've said, was horrendously high, and people were more prone to infections than we are because they didn't have antibiotics and the like. But nevertheless, if you got to adulthood in the Middle Ages, you had a decent chance of getting to your 60s and 70s. 15th century Italy, where the records are really good, demographic historians have worked out about 15% of the population of a lot of Italian cities in the early 15th century was over 60. I think for comparison, it's about 25% of the population of the UK at the moment. So it's higher now, but maybe not sort of much higher than you'd think. And so a lot of this stuff, a lot of this healthy living stuff is about helping people to get to be much older. And so, they are very interested in what they can do to do that. And healthy living is obviously key. And then they've got some slightly stranger ideas, like they're quite keen on the idea that, well, maybe an infusion of youthful bodily fluids could help you. So maybe if you drink a young man's blood or drink some breast milk, that will help you live longer. I mean, it sounds mad, but that tech billionaire, Brian somebody, who's injecting himself with his teenage son's plasma because he thinks it's going to help him live longer, it's not that different, really, is it? And I mean, they were also interested, and we're interested in sort of wonder drugs that will help you live longer. They thought maybe gold could be the answer, because it's the perfect element, it's perfectly balanced. So, well, if you eat the perfectly balanced element, that will help you to be perfectly balanced, they think. That's really popular at the Papal Curia for a while. All the cardinals drinking gold. The late 13th century, Pope John the 21st apparently was always going around he knew how to live a really long, healthy life. And then a ceiling fell on him and he died. So that was the end of that one. So I suppose that's maybe one lesson from the Middle Ages. People have been trying to crack the secret of living forever for centuries, and if somebody tells you they've worked it out, maybe you shouldn't believe them. But thinking a bit more broadly, I mean, the book is not, despite the title, I'm not suggesting that anybody does any of these things. And obviously there's lots of things in the Middle Ages that we wouldn't want to copy. But I think I do quite like some of their ideas. I quite like the fact that humoral medicine and the idea that everybody's got their own individual balance of humours means that medieval medicine is quite individualised. So they think in terms of the strengths and weaknesses of each individual body and how they can work with those. I think that's quite a good idea. I think that what we've talked about, sort of the way they're interested in the mind-body connection and how they don't think they can separate those out. And I think that maybe is sometimes something that we could think a bit more about. But I suppose overwhelmingly the thing that I like about medieval medicine, and there are lots of things I don't like about medieval medicine, like the phlebotomy, but I think their whole emphasis on prevention is quite a good one, and something that does increasingly chime with our own ideas about what we should do to staying healthy. So although our modern treatments obviously are much more effective, and we wouldn't want to try medieval medicine for ourselves, I do think there seems to me to be some merit in emulating this preventative approach and doing our best to keep ourselves healthy for as long as possible. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Catherine, for that. That was absolutely excellent. And I would say the book is lovely. I found it absolutely fascinating. We do have some time for some questions, and I think we've got a couple of roving microphones. Now, just to be aware, the lights are shining in our eyes, so if you're in the back section, can you wave quite vigorously at me? Because I can't necessarily see you. But we have got a couple of questions down the front, so we take this one first. Thank you very much.
They put a lot of emphasis on the four humours. Do you know, did they have a way of assessing each person on the balance of the four humours? Because you did mention near the end that they recognise that individuals may have differences in the humours.
Yeah, so I mean, there are all sorts of things they look at. And I mean, one of the things is sort of what somebody looks like, because obviously, if you're particularly red-faced, they'll see that as meaning you're a particularly sort of hot and sort of blood sanguine person. But so the best way to work out somebody's sort of humoral state is to look at their urine, and because obviously, so it's seen as a byproduct of digestion, so it's showing you everything that's in somebody's body, and they are really keen on examining people's urine. I think I had a picture of the sort of the colour chart. And that they are really keen on that, on comparing the doctor. I can't look at those wheels, one of those wheels, and tell you what your humoral balance is, but a medieval doctor would be able to look at one of those and tell you based on that what your state is. I think that really appealed to people because it felt really evidence-based. So it felt, in the same way as we quite like a test if we go to the doctor. That was really popular, to the extent that people used to send, if they couldn't get to their doctor, they'd send a sample to them. It was basically diagnosis by mail order, and it carried on being really popular into the 17th, 18th century. Even once doctors start to go, not sure this actually works, patients still want it. It's really popular. Yeah.
And is it true that as well as using the colour chart, they might have tasted it as well?
There is some stuff about tasting it and sort of, looking at the sediment in it and sniffing it and, all sorts of horrible stuff,
They were properly into it.
Yeah.
We've got another question down here, and I'll come to you. Yeah.
Very refreshing to understand a bit more about medieval guide to healthy living, because I think I'm not the only person in this room. When you think about medieval living, you have this preconceived idea of the body waste being chucked out the window,
Yeah.
Poor dental care, blackened or absent teeth, and syphilis. Why is that always a thing that seems to be shown on TV programmes about, medieval life?
Yeah, I don't know, because historians have been trying to shake it for years, but it is very entrenched, isn't it? I think it is partly, actually, I think it's partly about us. I think it sort of makes us feel better about ourselves in the sense that we're not sort of dirty like them. And maybe also that it means sort of something like the plague couldn't happen again. I think maybe, I don't know if that makes sense. That maybe says, but also, I mean, it's quite entertaining, isn't it? All this.
We're just laughing because that might have come up in conversation in the green room before. The concept of syphilis might have come up before we came out. So yes, we are bad for that. If we can take this one and then we go for that one next.
Thank you very much. That was great. I was just interested in the sort of class dynamics of this, because obviously all the illustrations come from wealthy classes, and I guess most of the texts are in Latin. So how did this get down to the working class, to the peasants, and how much were they following it?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously, and I think it's still true today, that it is, healthy living is more accessible to those who are, comfortably off, isn't it? That, unfortunately, is still true. In terms of how it's trickling down, I think because this system of medicine, we can see it, say, it comes from this elite sort of physicians, but we can see even relatively sort of ordinary people practicing in the localities. There's a chap called John Crophill, he's a bailiff in Essex in the 15th century, who seems to have practiced medicine on the side, as you do, as your sort of second job. But we know about him because his commonplace book has survived. And in that, he's copied out these little extracts from medical texts, and he also keeps a record of his patients. And so we can see he's treating very ordinary people. He's treating the local shepherds, he's treating local labourers, and he's treating them with the same things as you would get, very high up in society. The other thing, actually, that seems to help medical knowledge trickle down, and again, this sort of doesn't quite fit with our view of the Middle Ages, because we see medicine and religion very much being in conflict, but actually the church. Because the church are quite keen on the idea that priests need to know about health so that they can perform decent pastoral care. But they also seem to have loved a medical metaphor in their seminars. And so there are quite a lot of medieval texts which are sort of model sermons for parish priests who maybe are not up to writing their own to use. And they are full of this sort of medical stuff. So you can see it sort of trickling down. And certainly, the very poor, I suspect, couldn't have done a lot of this, but certainly by the end of the Middle Ages, your average urban artisan, a lot of them are literate, and a lot of them we can see that they're sort of, again, particularly in Italy by the 15th century, they have these commonplace books, and they are copying out chunks of regimens. And once the printing press comes in, some of the most popular printed texts, when the printing presses come in, are short regimens aimed at a general audience. So it, as I say, definitely easier for somebody very rich to do this, but it definitely is trickling down, I think.
Do we have one? Yes, just over here.
Thank you, Catherine. It's been very informative and entertaining. It's done much to adjust the balance of my humours, I'm happy to tell you, and more so my appreciation of the National Health Service. I was interested in what public actions were being taken in medieval times. You've enlightened us to the greater awareness than perhaps we'd suspected of true health problems. Cornwallis sued 6 butchers because they dumped the waste, etc. Was there bylaws in force? Did the courts find in his favour?
I don't think we know the outcome of that particular case, unfortunately. But definitely there are butchers who get fined for that sort of thing. And say a lot of public health type offences, people who get prosecuted for dumping rubbish in inappropriate places, particularly dumping rubbish in waterways where they're going to contaminate the water supply. And people who are prosecuted and definitely fined for selling bad food. There's a woman in Norwich in the 15th century who keeps selling bad pies, and she gets fined 2 or 3 times until she's eventually banned from selling pies. So definitely, it is something that we can see, not only that the laws exist, but that they are followed through and that people do get punished for them, yeah.
Yeah, we've got one up the back on that side. Yeah, welcome to the front. Yeah.
How widespread was the use of medicinal plants for medicine, and how effective were they?
I think the answer is very, very widespread. A lot of that's where we do struggle to see what ordinary people were doing. We know that ordinary people were making their own medicines, and a lot of them would have been herbal. We struggle to see what they are. But we can see even in elite texts, a lot of the medicines obviously are made from those sorts of ingredients. How effective were they? I think it's a mixed bag. Certainly people have done work on medieval remedies, and they've tested them out, and they found they do kill the bacteria they're supposed to kill. So, there's a particular one that somebody did a big study on a few years ago that I think was an eye salve, wasn't it? That, yeah, they quite definitely, they tested it on the bacteria for that condition and it does kill it. It would have worked. I think definitely, there are some things they do that are, frankly, completely mental. But I think a lot of it was working. And they are very keen on the idea. If you look at medieval recipe collections, often somebody will make a note next to it so it is proven. And so they are quite sort of keen on the idea of testing the recipe. And they might not know in modern chemical terms why it's working, but they know it's working and it's worth keep doing.
I think we've got one down the front this side as well. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. In medieval times in York, countless pilgrims came to York Minster to pray for healing at the shrines of St. William, the patron saint of York. I'm just interested in your thoughts on the dynamic that was happening there, the sort of fusion between the supernatural and what was happening in their bodies.
Yeah, I mean, I think it reflects sort of an intertwined sense of medicine and religion that to us feel like two separate things, but that to them were inextricably intertwined. And I don't think we can or we should try and separate those out. One of the things that I think is very interesting about pilgrimage is that often when you look at the sort of the records around the shrine, is that there is a lot of sort of looking after people going on, you know, pilgrims being provided with good food, with places to sleep, and that sort of thing. And I suppose a cynic might go, well, okay, that's what's actually healing them. And there is one 14th century doctor who talks about it's a shrine that specialises, I think, in anal fistulas. And he actually says he thinks he is quite cynical about whether this shrine is actually working or whether it's actually the travel and the sort of the heat of the exercise of walking to get there that is drying up these problems. It's a rather unpleasant example, but I think you can say even then they were thinking about the interactions between medicine and religion. But obviously it is a really important part of medieval medicine. Although what is interesting, obviously, is that I think even then often is the last resort. You know, we tend to think of people sort of, medieval person gets ill, goes running to shrine. And often what we can actually see is them doing sort of what we would call sensible medical things and going to the shrine when those don't work. Or often accepting that they have worked in tandem.
Thank you. We've got one at the back, and I'm very sorry because you were right in my blind spot. So yes, thank you.
Hello, thank you. I was just wondering, was there payment involved in diagnosis and treatment?
Was the what, sorry?
Payment. Money.
Payment. Yes. I mean, yes. Obviously, it is very much a marketplace in most cases, and that definitely would shape who you could afford to have, and would mean that the rich were getting the sort of the most trained practitioners. Although whether that means they were getting the best treatment is something of a moot point. You know, some people have argued, well, you know, a lot of medical, there are universities where you can study medicine in the Middle Ages, but the curriculum is very theoretical. And so I think there is a case to be made that actually you might be better with that chap who, you know, has actually amputated 100 legs, and yours will be 101, than the bloke who's only ever read it about it in a book. So that, you know, there is a bit of a swings and roundabouts thing going on there.
I think, unfortunately, we are just about out of time. I've been keeping an eye on this. We might have time for one final question. So I just saw a hand just go up there. So final question. Thanks.
I'm very conscious that the professions of the doctor and the healing woman were very different, and I suspect that their methods were very different as well. Does that show up in your records?
I think, the doctors are much better documented than the sort of the domestic medicine. But I think they are broadly still underpinned by a lot of this humoral stuff. And certainly once we get into the sort of 16th, 17th century where we're still operating in that humoral context, and we do start to get more evidence of domestic medicine, it is broadly along the same patterns, actually. It's, you know, it's not two completely distinct traditions.
I think that is us just about out of time. Thank you so much, Catherine, for speaking to us and for answering so many questions. I'm pleased we managed to get through so many of them as well. I just wanted to highlight that your brilliant book, which I found absolutely fascinating, genuinely loved, is available for sale today from our brilliant independent booksellers who are Fox Lane Books. And Catherine, I believe, is also able to sign them for you if you'd like to get a signed copy today as well. This is only day 2 of a jam-packed York Festival of Ideas 2026. So if you haven't had a look at the rest of the programme, please do have a look at that as well. And hopefully we'll see you at some events in the future too. But can we once again, massive thank you to Catherine. Thank you.